soundproofing because I keep thinking about that for my office. Like, should I do something?
Yeah,
Don't
it looks cool. It's mostly just for the look. It's actually the stuff's not too expensive, and I think you're actually supposed to put the soundproofing like behind your monitor, so like the sound like doesn't bounce off or something like that. And
Yeah, right.
so I just kind of have it there in the background just because it kind of looks cool. But I have
It
like
does look.
artwork over there.
It does look cool. It does look cool.
Yeah, I like your setup is pretty nice too. You got the nice bokeh blurred there.
Yeah, I just replaced pretty much everything in the
Yeah,
home office and got a decent camera at last. And it just makes such a big difference.
right. All right, cool. So you want to start this thing off? I'm familiar with you and your website, but maybe for my audience who might not know who you are, do you want to give a brief kind of introduction on, some of the stuff you do, what you're working on?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Troy Hunt, Australian, as you can hear. I'm stuck in Australia because I can't go anywhere anymore. And I run a website called HaveIBeenPwned, which is a data breach notification service that you can search for your email address on. It'll tell you if you've been in any data breaches that have been seen floating around. And at the moment, there's about 10.1 billion records from data breaches in there, including a bunch of mine as well. Thank you very much, hackers.
So yeah, I've actually recommended your product here on the channel sometimes. I've made a couple of videos talking about, how to find out if you've been part of breaches and stuff like that. I think it's one of the easiest ways to kind of educate people with online privacy, to kind of show them some of the screw ups that websites have had. It's definitely pretty telling to see how many websites do screw up, and easily see that with your website. I guess it might have been something you've been asked before, but just for new people out there who might have seen your website the first time, or find out information about that they've had accounts that have been leaked, what is maybe the number one thing that people could do to maybe prevent, I guess, from getting pwned, might you say?
So I think we've got to sort of break it down into two different categories, and the bit about what can you do to stop being pwned, short of just not giving you information to anyone, there's not a lot of control you have. Now I'm in Have I Been Pwned I think 20 times now, because I have a Dropbox account and a LinkedIn account,
Right.
and all sorts of other just very normal everyday things. And unfortunately, if you want to use, let's say, LinkedIn, and probably most people watching this, you have a LinkedIn account, you got to give them your email address, and you got to create an account and a bunch of other personal information. So in terms of not being pwned, the only option is not to provide information, and very often that's not an option. I think the more pertinent question is, what can we do to make sure that when we are inevitably pwned, that the damage is minimized? And the biggest risk that most people face with being in a data breach is that they've reused their passwords. Someone takes your passwords, and then they go to another service and they log into your accounts. And this is just absolutely rampant. So here's a fun trick. Go to Twitter, search for Netflix hacked, and look at all the people saying, hey, someone in Mexico is watching Spanish movies under my account. My account got hacked. And it's like, well, did it get hacked, or did you just use the same terrible password that you use everywhere, and somewhere else got hacked and now they're into your Netflix?
I'd like to talk about that a little bit. So do you think it's whose responsibility do you think it is? Is it the website for policing accounts and making sure users are, because I know some websites, when they have vulnerabilities and stuff like this, they'll email people, say, hey, you may have been part of this breach. We're going to lock your account, or we're going to make you reset your password. Some services don't do it as well. So do you think it's more responsibility of the website to ensure people are using secure passwords, or do you think it's also users' responsibility, or whose do you think it is more, I guess also could be the question.
Yes, it's a shared responsibility.
Shared responsibility.
So I don't think that blame lies in any one place, and there have been many occasions where I've been on Twitter and I've said, look, someone has had an account taken over because they reused their password, and then people get very upset with me and they say, well, you're victim blaming. You shouldn't blame the victim. And so, well, yeah, they're the victim, but the only reason they have this problem is because they reused their passwords. Now, also, there's a question about the accountability on behalf of websites whom an attacker comes and logs into with legitimate credentials. And there's kind of two ways of looking at that too, because on the one hand, I'm very sympathetic to anyone running a service, and we're sitting here saying, hey, when someone comes to your website and they have the right username and the right password, but they're not that person, you need to somehow figure out that they're not the right person and lock them out. And by the way, when you do that, don't destroy the experience for legitimate users as well. So I have a degree of sympathy there. On the other hand, this is such a well-known problem. And we've seen it. If I just think back to the last 6 months, we saw Disney Plus getting hammered with this. We've seen a bunch of other big brands. Google Nest was another one that had big problems recently, like literally attackers logging into people's Google Nest accounts and looking at them in their living room via the camera. So we know this is a problem. And there are ways out there of mitigating this risk. So this is why I say it's a shared responsibility. Everyone's got a bit of a role to play.
Right. I think there are some things like specifically companies can do, hopefully to enforce, stuff like two-factor authentication, things like that. I think should really be implemented on a lot of websites for sure to kind of prevent some of that stuff.
Well, I mean, that's a challenging one too. When was the last time you set up 2FA for a non-technical relative, and how much fun was it? Right. So
yeah, that's true. It does kind of make it a pain in the ass for sure.
Look, I have 2FA turned on every single one of my things that supports it, but it sucks. It is a terrible user experience, and it is enormously effective. But the problem is the adoption rates are just extremely low. So for any service where it's optional, they're low single-digit percentage rates of adoption. And I think the main exception is these guys here, Apple, because you literally have a physical authenticator in your hand and they can make the experience much more slick. But when you're saying to people, let's say it's Dropbox, go and get yourself a soft authenticator app. And you've got to make sure you save your backup codes if you have those. And then when you get a new device, don't forget to migrate your soft tokens.
Right.
Otherwise, what's going to happen is you're going to get in contact with Dropbox and say, hey, Dropbox, you know how I turned on this thing so that someone has my username and password, but not the soft token? You don't let them in. I've got my username and my password, but I lost the soft token. Can you let me in? So it puts a big burden back on the services actually providing 2FA as well. It's a really, really blunt instrument.
Right. I think some services like Authy kind of have an interesting way of, you could kind of get a new phone and migrate a lot of the stuff. So if anyone out there has that problem, that could be kind of a solution. I do also think that perhaps companies, there have been certain gaming companies that have two-factor authentication. And of course, losing your gaming account isn't the end of the world compared to, maybe a big email service that you're using. But maybe if companies could incentivize, even though it is a hassle, make some incentives. I don't know, maybe Dropbox could give you 10 extra gigabytes or something like that if you enable two-factor authentication. I think that could be cool.
So MailChimp does that. MailChimp, I use MailChimp for my newsletters and they give me 10% off,
nice.
which is great. I love that. I would really, really like to think that someone has done the math at MailChimp and said, look, when people turn this on, we actually get a reduction in account takeovers and it lowers our overhead, so we can pass that saving on. Wouldn't that be nice if
save money on the customer service trying to fix that accounts? So besides HaveIBeenPwned, is there anything else like that's been like notable or in your career that you'd like people to know about, or maybe there's some other kind of project you're working on right now that's really cool to you?
Well, I would normally spend a lot of time traveling and speaking. So the last, I've been independent the last 5 years, and I've spent most of that time traveling around the world. I do a lot of workshops for companies who are building software. So a lot of workshops for developers to understand what SQL injection is, for example. I do normally travel and do a lot of conference talks as well. But I mean, these days, I still do all these things. It's just like now, I just sit here and I'm not jet lagged and I don't charge people airfares and accommodations. So in many ways, that's actually pretty good. So I still do all that. And of course, as we've discussed before, I've started this advisory role with NordVPN as well, which is interesting too. So that's something a little bit different to what I'd normally do, but it's a good time to diversify.
Yeah. I saw that you had a YouTube channel as well. You kind of do some live streams and you just kind of do like updates on your work. Is that like mostly like content of the channel, just talking with people?
Yeah, so this is something I've done it every single week, and I think I'm up to 204 or something like that. So I guess I'm approaching 4 years actually, believe it or not. And it's normally like a recap of things I've written about during the week, but in a more colloquial sort of context. Particularly when I was traveling, it'd be like, here's where I am in the world at the moment, here's what I'm doing. And I did always pre-record them. And then recently I realized that's actually a bit of work pre-recording them. So I'll just do it live and it will make my life easier.
Yeah.
And then I realized that's actually pretty good because people tune in and you get engagement and interaction. So now, particularly since I'm in the one place the whole time and I can do things on a regular time too, I'm just doing them live. So today's a Friday for me because I'm in the future in Australia. So I'm going to do one again in 6 or 7 hours from now in my evening.
Nice. Very cool. So I want to talk about VPNs a little bit. Do you personally use a VPN? Some people say they're using VPN 24/7. I was just kind of curious about how much you use a VPN. Mostly my channel is talking about VPNs, and I see people arguing all the time on my channel, if you really need one or not, how much should you use one? Should you just use one on public Wi-Fi? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and look, I think we've got to sort of segment what practical value you get from a VPN versus what protections you get by default anyway versus what are some of the other value propositions you might have for a VPN. So yes, I do use a VPN probably every day at the moment, very often for things like when I'm verifying the integrity of data breaches, and I might not want to have my IP address attached to absolutely everything I do. I might want some privacy. That's a really good case for the VPN. My partner is Norwegian. She likes to watch Norwegian television, a lot of which you need to be in Norway in order to watch. So that works very well for her. Normally when I was traveling, if I did anything of particularly of importance whilst in strange places, I would use a VPN as well. So there's a bunch of different use cases. I guess on the complementing that, I was going to say on the flip side, but it's not really flip side. But complementing that, we're getting so much more security by default in terms of encryption everywhere at the moment as well, that we're on a really good trajectory there. So we've got something like about 85% of all web traffic sent over HTTPS, right, which is fantastic. There are still gaps in that. We still have things like trust on first use problems. When you type in www.mybank.com into your browser, most of the time it defaults to an insecure connection. So that is still at risk. A VPN is great for making sure that first hop is secured. Right. So, good use cases, but very, very different.
Talking more about generalized privacy now, I think definitely after Snowden, it kind of came out with some of his revelations, 2012, 2013. I think definitely people are thinking more about privacy, especially with tools like your website. I guess I want to talk a little bit about kind of the scope going forward in terms of privacy. Do you think websites are, getting better at securing things? Do you think privacy is getting, better or worse? What is kind of your general outlook? Is it pessimistic, optimistic?
I think probably the fairest way to describe it is I think privacy is different. So there's a few different reasons for that. So one is that I've heard this term used a few times before, which is data breach fatigue, where people are just like, it's another data breach. Who cares? I'm all over the place anyway, and they sort of have that attitude. And then counteracting that, we've got regulations such as GDPR in Europe, which is a very privacy-centric regulation. Let's try and give people more control over where their information appears, which is great. Now, of course, that then leads to all sorts of other problems, which is another rabbit hole. But then I look at my kids. So my kids are 8 and 10 years old, and they are growing up in an era where they have never known not having internet. They've never known not having supercomputers in their pockets or on their wrist, as it may be. And I imagine that their view to privacy as they get older is going to be very, very different to, say, yours and mine. They're growing up in a world where they haven't known a time where you don't put everything on social media or share information with all sorts of unknown people. So I think it's just a very, very different landscape. And I find it fascinating, and I don't quite know where it's going to go, but it is an interesting time.
For sure. I'm kind of curious about your website. You just talked about how there's so many breaches and stuff like that. Can you speak a little bit about the process of working on HaveIBeenPwned? What kind of man hours does it take, just entering in breaches, kind of researching and doing that kind of stuff? Can you explain a little bit about the process?
Yeah, well, I mean, the man hours is probably the easiest bit. It goes up and down. So on average, over the last 3 or 4 years, I've loaded one data breach every 4 days. At the end of July, start of August, I loaded 16 in the space of 2 weeks because there was just a massive spate of them. In fact, that happened sort of over the preceding months of this year, but a bunch of data got dumped at the same time. So that consumed a bunch of cycles. I've sort of gone from it being purely a hobby project when I started it in 2013 through to something which started to consume a lot of time, particularly last year. And now I've tried to sort of back off on that time commitment a little bit, keep it maybe probably less than half my available time, but it's not a consistent sort of cadence, if you like. And of course, I do have other things that I need to do. I still do the workshops and the talks and things like that. So they're scheduled events, data breaches and stuff get put on hold, and I go and do those. And I think that the interesting thing for me in the longer term, and what I'm giving a lot of thought to now, is how do I make sure that if I go out in my backyard and get eaten by a shark, possibility in Australia, someone else takes over. So what's the survivorship of the service? So I announced a couple of weeks ago that I'm planning to open source everything. I want other people to be able to step in and run this thing. Let me rephrase, open source the code, not the data. The people who are saying just dump all the data publicly, never going to happen.
Mm-hmm. I'm just wondering, like, the website is pretty transparent, listing all these things these companies have done, leaks and stuff and like that. Have you ever like had any companies that have been like mad at you or trying to get stuff removed?
Not of any serious nature. And in fact, the one that I keep coming back to, which is I think the maddest I've seen someone. So that there's a website called Adult Fan Fiction, and it's basically like fantasy erotica where like a werewolf is in love with a vampire, and so whatever. I don't care. I don't judge. It's like it's a data breach. I'm just going to process it. And someone sent me their data, and I tried to get in touch with the company. Couldn't get any reply whatsoever. Start asking on Twitter, and this was sort of after sending via official email channels. Nothing. Twitter, nothing. Eventually load the data, and they got quite upset, and they wrote a forum post saying, the Troy sort of sells all these services when he runs these workshops, which is just rubbish. Most people might not have high-priced lawyers or something. We don't, but we're going to go after this guy because this is not real. And then I think the penny dropped that it was real. It was all their data, and it just went quiet. But look, to be honest, what I've done to sort of temper that is I always try to get in touch with organizations.
Okay.
I have conversations, either voice or video like this, with a lot of them, and they sort of go, oh, look, well, he's not a bad guy. He doesn't even have a hoodie. Like, must be fine. And you have a sort of a mature conversation. And then I work a lot with governments and law enforcement and things like that. And I guess keep good relationships with the right parties to have good relationships with. So no, look, there's never been anything of any serious note.
Some VPN companies have like very anonymous owners, and there has been some kickback from people noticing VPN companies that have gotten really big, but they're not always transparent, I guess, with who owns them or investors and stuff like that. Would you feel comfortable talking about, know, if that level of transparency is important for consumers, or is that something?
Well, my view of things, and part of the reason I have the relationship with Nord is that I think I've got a pretty good sense of what it is that people are looking for when it comes to things like privacy. And things like transparency are a big part of this. So I fully understand people saying, look, if we're going to trust a VPN company with our data, which is what you're doing, by the way, I mean, you're basically taking the trust away. Say if I connect from home from my local ISP and they're no longer seeing my traffic, but I'm delegating the trust to the VPN provider because they do have access to that traffic via whatever exit node I'm going out of. I'm delegating trust. And I think people have a very reasonable question, which is, who am I trusting my data to? Now, we then sort of end up in this kind of odd middle ground where it's like the whole reason we're going down the VPN route is we want things like privacy and anonymity. On the other hand, we would like to have transparency of knowing who we're getting privacy and anonymity from. So I do see a little bit of a paradox there. And then, of course, in the case of someone like Nord, they've obviously chosen jurisdictions that enable them to maximize trust and privacy and things like this. But then that can also be seen as being evasive as well. So what I think is important for any of these VPN providers is being able to clearly and honestly and transparently articulate why they've made decisions around everything from shareholders to directors to jurisdictions. Because that to me is sort of the expectation that people have when they're inferring all of this trust to someone else. And geez, I mean, think about the amount of information, just metadata alone, that we have going out through our internet connections, particularly when we use a mobile device or something these days. The trust is absolutely critical.
In some ways, the way you phrase that, it almost makes it seem like, I mean, some people do have the argument that maybe it's like too much trust to put in any one company. I mean, we have things like antivirus and stuff like that, and at a certain level, they're on your computer, and not all of them have the best privacy policies and stuff like that. And you're installing the program to perhaps remove other programs. But I guess perhaps, do you think it's problematic maybe that we are trusting these companies to like funnel everything? Or do you think it could be worth it in the end?
You've always got to trust someone, right? And maybe trust someone is not even the right word, but you've always got to be dependent on a party somewhere to, say, route your traffic. Now, if you're not using a VPN, then that party is your ISP. Your ISP is going to see, particularly when we talk about everything from DNS queries. Of course, we have things like DNS over HTTPS now, which starts to give us more privacy back. We've got things like HTTPS, which is great for encrypting traffic, but we've still got TLS handshakes and SNI, which does send host names. So if someone's sitting there in the traffic can actually see who you're connecting to. They just can't see what you're doing once you're there. So the discussion then becomes, who are going to be the intermediaries who have visibility to that? Now, if I don't turn on my VPN, for me here, it's a local Aussie ISP. So they're going to see all my things. If I do turn on the VPN, well, it's Nord, and they could see all my things. You've almost sort of got to sit there and go, okay, well, who do I want to give that to? Now, this is before we even get into the other reasons you might use a VPN, but ultimately, someone is going to see that traffic. And look, I think one of the best things about the way the web is going at the moment is, as I said before, we're getting so much more encryption by default that at least now, regardless of who we choose, let's take the HTTPS example. We know that every time we connect to Facebook, even if you have no trust whatsoever in your ISP, for example, at least they can't see your password, and they can't see your auth tokens, and they can't see what people are writing on your wall. So we've got that. And I think the best possible scenario we can get to is as much encryption as possible inside our encrypted private tunnel as well.
Mm-hmm. I've seen you mention in a couple of your videos talking about maybe some of the marketing that VPNs do could be problematic. I was wondering if specifically you had anything in mind, if you want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so I think that the challenge is, particularly when it's facing consumers as well, how do we properly espouse the virtues of a VPN without being hyperbolic, without overplaying the risks, and also while still acknowledging the security controls we do have. So yeah, I keep coming back to HTTPS. It's great. We've got a lot of HTTPS from top to bottom on a lot of the services we use today, but we do still have some gaps as well. I mentioned trust on first use when you type in a domain and it defaults to HTTP most of the time, with exceptions. That's a good example. But then you've got to figure out, all right, well, how do we take something like trust on first use and a lack of HSTS and preload, and then we put it in a sense that my mum and dad can understand? Because VPNs these days are becoming very consumer-centric as well. So we've got to try and find the right fit there. One of the things that I'd really like to see, and in fact I do a lot of stuff with Ubiquity as well, who does a lot of networking equipment, is I'd really love to see it become easier to just VPN tunnel directly to your home router. Like, let me set this up at the home. I haven't mentioned this to Nord yet. They might hear it here first. But I'd love to see that sort of thing where it's like, let me set that up at the router, put it in place, and then all of the different things that I've got around me and on my wrist and I'm talking to you on just automatically get the protection of that tunnel. Because if we could do that and make it easy to get set up for people in the first place, then everyone gets the benefit and we don't have to sort of get too much into the nuts and bolts about different devices and turning things on and off.
Mm-hmm. I think some companies have been kind of partnering around with companies like a VisiBox. It's kind of has the idea of like a VPN hotspot. Is it kind of what you're thinking of?
In a way, but to do that at the network level. So,
Okay.
I mean, a good example of that is I use a Pi hole. So a Pi hole is effectively DNS routing, runs on a Raspberry Pi, and it just black holes a whole bunch of ad networks and things like this. So rather than me running ad blockers on all of my different things, I run the Pi hole, it's plugged in the network, the DNS settings of the router point to the Pi hole. Now, whether I'm on my iPhone or my Apple TV, I get the benefits that provides. And I love the fact it just plugs into the network, and then everything in the network gets a protection.
Very nice, very nice. So thanks so much for the interview. Is there anything you'd like to shout out? Let my audience know where to contact you or follow some of your work?
Well, hey, the only other thing I'll add, and we kind of touched on it briefly before, but get a password manager. Like we sort of said, hey, make sure you use strong and unique passwords because that's important. But like, don't put them in your brain. Your brain is not going to scale. So go and get a password manager. I use one called 1Password that I've used for the last decade. It just takes so much stress away, and it's one of the single easiest, most effective things people can do for their security and privacy.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks for chatting, and stay private out there.
Awesome. Thanks, Tom.